The first crusade was 1096 and lasted until about 1145. And then the second crusade went. The second crusade was already joined by English and French and German. And that was a bit of a disaster. The third crusade was even worse. And the fourth crusade was a total disaster, because in the fourth crusade, the Catholics went straight across Europe and conquered Constantinople in 1204. That was, I mean, what's the crusade all about? You're going to fight the infidel. Yeah, but first let's take the Greek Orthodox. And they conquered Constantinople in 1204. But in the interesting people who participated, one of the most interesting characters in the Second Crusade was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the Queen of Aquitaine, and at one point was the wife of Louis VII of France, and he went with her on the Second Crusade, but he was a wet rag, you could say, a weakling, and she finally got rid of him. And then she married Henry II of England, and she had a couple of sons with him. One was Richard the Lionhearted, and the other was John, King John. Richard the Lionhearted went on the crusade as well. She went on the crusade, and she stayed in Antioch, where the ruler of Antioch was one of her cousins. She was a very great influence because she was the Queen of Aquitaine and had power on her own. A very remarkable woman in many ways. But while they were going on the crusade, they went several ways. They sailed. They also went across Europe, and they were being harassed and bothered by the Greek Orthodox, because they saw them as potential enemies, which they were. After in the Fourth Crusade, they did make war against the other Christians. One of the other characters who went on the Second Crusade was the German King Friedrich Barbarossa. And he went on the crusade and never arrived, never returned. The great mystery. And Barbarossa becomes an interesting figure in German mythology, even down to the Second World War, when they launched the invasion of Russia on June the 22nd, 1941. They called it Operation Barbarossa. Of course, came to be the great disaster. Essentially, the Crusades were designed to overthrow the Muslim power. It was a war against the Muslim power. So that's why there was a Fourth Crusade. And that's why King Louis IX of France in 1260 also set out on a crusade. And they also made a slight progress. They established a fortress at Caesarea, which is still there. Louis IX also died in the process. It was a war against the Muslim world, the Christian world against the Muslim world, and it has many phases. For example, there was when Charles Martel stopped the Arab conquest of France, they called that a crusade, namely a war of the cross against the Muslims. Later on, Charlemagne sent an army to reconquer Spain for the Christians. That army was destroyed. It's recorded, the whole story is recorded in the earliest French literature, was the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland. Roland is the story of the Frenchman Roland who led the crusade against the Arabs of Spain and was defeated. That was around 820, 830. So there were several thrusts, but the Great Crusade, the First Crusade, was already when the Normans felt that they were strong, and the Pope said, now I have a real army that I can send against the Muslim world. And then it continued because they felt they could conquer more. But by the time we get to the Second Crusade, the Muslim world has been taken over by a Turk by the name of Saladin. And Saladin was a fierce conqueror, and he defeated the Crusaders in the land of Israel and smashed them and drove them out. So it was all over. I mean, the Crusaders had lost everything by the time of the Third Crusade. And some of them were simply, look, Richard the Lionhearted is an interesting figure, a mysterious figure, because Richard the Lionhearted was King of England after the death of his father. Immediately he went on the crusade. He went on the crusade. He did not do too well because he was fighting against Saladin, who was far more successful. He started to go home. He was taken captive by the King of Germany and held for ransom. So his whole participation in the crusade was a total nothing, because he went, he didn't succeed on the battlefield, he was on his way home, he was taken captive, and the king demanded a tremendous ransom, and finally Richard Lionheart said, okay, I'll pay you. I'll go home and I'll make the money and I'll send it to you. He let him go back to England. Richard goes back to England. He gets into a battle in a little war, and he's shot and killed. So the whole career of Richard the Lionhearted is 11 years on the throne and 1.5 years in England. Not much. And he's succeeded by his brother John. And John, of course, is already a different story. King John, who is considered the bad guy, and was not very good, incidentally. But John had many forces against him, and therefore was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which yielded some of his power to the barons, and which the British say is the beginning of British democracy. Actually, it was the forerunner of what came to be the House of Lords. But what the Magna Carta did was actually take some power away from King John and grant it to large landowners, and that in effect weakened his power. And the other reason why King John was defeated by the barons is that Pope Innocent III was against him, and let it be known. And Pope Innocent III, who was the most powerful of the popes in all of history, I mean, Pope Innocent III was the one who could just command all the kingdoms of Europe. But John was trying to be a little less dependent on him, perhaps a little more independent. And Pope Innocent III made it clear that he does not favor this English king who is a little too rebellious. And the barons took this as a signal. So they fought him at the Battle of Runnymede and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. But at the same time, Pope Innocent III could send an army of Germans and Frenchmen to make war against the Albigensians, who were non-Catholic Christians, and wipe them out. That's another interesting feature of that period, that there were Protestant movements in the Catholic Church all the time, you could say, from the very beginning. But the Albigensian movement was a big one. In southern France, a large number of southern Frenchmen were Albigensian Christians. They were non-Catholic Christians. And a monk by the name of Dominique, Saint Dominique, preached up and down, screaming bloody murder, that they should be wiped out. I mean, this great Saint Dominique, who was the founder of the Dominican order of preachers, and these were tremendous inquisitors over the course of the centuries. He just told the Pope Innocent III, you cannot neglect this, you have to destroy this movement. So the Pope said, all right, and he told the armies, he told the kings of Germany and of France, get them. They invaded the south and they wiped this out. They wiped them out completely. Nothing was left. Not a single one was left. Others remained. There was a small movement called the Waldensian Christians who survived. In fact, they have a church on East 74th Street in Manhattan. But that's a small group. But here and there were always these dissident Christians who didn't quite accept the Pope. But at the time of the supremacy of the papacy and its rule, in the 1200, that's the year 1200, 1215, that's when the church, you could say, really ruled Europe.